The land, the people. Rachel Pedden. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world, and they that dwell therein. Preemption. It has always seemed to me a book ought not need an introduction, that everything should be contained in the story or come with, O hindry suddenness, at the end, clarifying the whole dramatic business. An introduction by any other name is just as delaying, and my reaction has always been, get on with the story and let me find out for myself. On the other hand, if you see a great number of guests at a party, all unlike, you wish to know who they are and why you are all there. In the 4 chapters of The Land, the People, there are many people, all different. To put them into one book may seem omnivorous, yet they have one thing in common, the land. They all loved the land, lived close to it, and in the end their lives and thinking were shaped by it. And yet, at the end, as in the beginning, they were still all different. For all its stern discipline, the land fosters individualism, which is probably one clue to the reason for man's eternal need of a closeness with it. The farms and the people of this book are all in Indiana. This state, originally an agricultural state, whose people were so unsophisticated and independent of thought, they acquired a lasting national reputation for those qualities, summed up in the word hoser, has within late years become a leading industrial state. In the farming community in which I live, as generally in farming communities everywhere, the old patterns are changing almost as swiftly as cloud formations before a storm. The change is felt not only in farming areas, but in urban societies everywhere. Writers, speakers, citizens are remembering that man is anciently akin to earth and needs a close contact with it. The feeling is evident in the increased use of land for parks and the emphasis laid on conservation of our national resources and wilderness beauty, even inconsistently in the trend of people to move into the country and build houses, or to hold on tenaciously to a small farming acreage and live there while working in town for a living income. To say man is of the earth and that his well-being, even his very survival, depends on an occasional return to it is not enough. It is important to try to find out why this is true. Some people, those most distantly removed from farm living, accomplish the necessary return by going to parks, visiting farm friends and relatives, walking on grass in their own yards, or reading a book about country living. For others, notably farmers, a mere occasional return to the land is not enough. These lovers have a deep, insatiable passion to be close to the land. They are willing to gamble their strength and ingenuity on its response. Perhaps it is man's inherited infinitesimally small share of divinity that makes him restless and compels him to keep trying to possess the earth, remold it, dominate it, and too often waste it. The patient earth tolerates these lovers, nourishes, inspires, and comforts them. It disciplines and teaches them, and in the end accepts them back tenderly, but never truly surrenders to them nor lets them go free of their obligation. For man has an inescapable obligation to the land. It is his destiny to touch, observe, and learn from it, in his passionate effort to understand himself. Living close to the land, he sees rules that govern it, and he suspects that a good many of these apply to him also. He suspects also there are rules that apply only to him, or at least apply more acutely to him than to the rest of earth's creatures. He is endowed with a passion to discover what these laws are. Now and then he catches a glimpse of one, and the glimpse changes the shape of his thinking. For when a truth is thus discovered, it has to be accepted, no matter what cherished belief he hopes or hope it displaces. Man places his hope for eventual harmony on gathering up, piecing together, and understanding these truths. In the process of understanding the earth and its creatures, man begins slowly to understand himself, and in the same process, but in reverse, in his passion to reshape and dominate the earth, he comes near to destroying himself. It is often said that man has a built-in mechanism for self-destruction, that if all his great dreams and plans succeeded as he wished, they would end by destroying him. Fortunately, then, they never wholly succeed. Something intervenes, and the pattern of man's behavior never returns to its origin, completing a static circle, but approaches the point, swerves above and beyond it, and thus life spirals on and on, just as the farm year repeats itself year after year, following a pattern but never achieving identical repetition. A farmer comes to respect the land as much as he loves it, and when finally he yields to it, it is not defeat any more than a wheat harvest yielding to the combine is defeated. It is a harvest, useful, beautiful, eternally repeated. From the earth, man learns that his values, classifications of good and bad, necessary and dispensable, long and brief, are purely his own arbitrary values, and the earth does not necessarily endorse them. In the end, he learns to combine hope with humility, and a kindness and unquenchable gaiety. He has, as farmers say, made a crop. He has fulfilled his personal obligation to the land. Chiefly the farmers in this book are B. F. Mason, my father, who was not a farmer at all, but an orchardist; Dakin, a neighbor whose love of his farm almost took the place of all other love; Walter Bedin, my father-in-law, who turned to farming as inevitably as cornstalks reach upward in the hot July sun, and who presumably handed this inherited love of farming on down to his son Richard, an involuntary heritage that has led Dick and me through some difficult, painful, and also pleasant land experiences. The adult land need of our two children, who have grown up on the Maple Grove farm, remains yet to be fulfilled. So here, after all, is an introduction, and as Patrick Henry said, if this be treason. Chapter 1. High Gap is the Lord's. Shall we stop here a little while, suggested my sister Nina, who was driving. There, from the paved road, running gently between flanks of native forest, a little fork went off toward a crescended pole gateway, beside which the state of Indiana had set a respectful designation, Step Cemetery. In our childhood, living on our father's farm that is now part of this state-owned forest reserve, we called this place the Precinct, and we lived in a gaunt, gray, two-story house about 6 miles from it. The house was originally an inn. In the precinct, the older graves were marked only by unlettered chunks of stone, or not at all. It is still used, but the more recently set stones are professionally cut and inscribed. Nina and I read a few of them as we walked about, looking for unmarked graves of our grandfather, an uncle, and his small son, buried there long ago. All around us, native Indiana trees, maple, oak, hickory, walnut, tulip poplar, ash, hackberry, sumac, sassafras, wild cherry, beech, lifted their color-filled brushes toward the pale afternoon sky. and dripped bright drops of red, yellow, and brown on the ground beside green firs the state had planted when it took over the land from private owners in the 1920s. October was in full cry, but we were in a somber mood. We had just come from a house in a little town to which our mother had moved a few years earlier when she had begun living alone, and in which now she was dying. Through my mind ran the melody of a ballad people were singing that autumn. My daughter Carol had sung it over and over when she came home from DePaul University the week before for what we all thought would be a final visit with her grandmother. If you miss the train I'm on, you will know that I am gone. You can hear the whistle blow 100 miles. There were 7 children in the Mason family when we lived on the Orchard Farm. By the time my mother moved to the little town after my father's death, we were all grown and had homes of our own. 5 of us lived at great distances from mother, but all 7 went often to the little town to visit her. My sister Nina, who spends much of her time in a western state and travels a great deal, always came before or after a long trip. She and mother had gay, bantering visits, and when Nina left, mother always told her at the very last, "Drive carefully now and try not to cry." Nina has driven thousands of miles. When we lived on the Orchard Farm, mother could harness and drive any of the horses. She took pleasure in hitching up the little fat mule, Martha, to an open-top buggy and driving over the farm to gather apples or peaches from some isolated, self-planted tree, but she never learned to drive a car. My sister Grace, who lived with her husband, Muriel Lundy, in the country several miles from mother, went often to visit her and sometimes stayed several days at a time, doing little house-loving chores mother could no longer do, such as washing and ironing the embroidered pillow slips and treasured old Battenberg doilies, mending mother's favorite dresses, and just companionably talking. Muriel, whose own mother died when he was a little boy, was a special friend of mother's, went to see her almost every week, and liked to tease Grace by saying the real reason he wanted to marry her was so he could have Laura for his mother-in-law. My sister Miriam, who writes children's books, came often also for visits and took mother out in her car and let mother lecture her. I, who lived nearest on a farm, probably went oftenest, and it fell to my lot to make mother do the hard things she didn't want to do, such as going to the hospital now and then or learning finally to use a wheelchair. That October afternoon, Nina and I had made her as comfortable as possible and left her asleep in the care of Leah, her devoted housekeeper companion. I don't know which of us suggested going back to the place that had been our childhood home, or in fact whether it was actually suggested in words at all. Nina and I have always been close in thought and mood, and it may have been just another of the many mutual decisions we have reached simultaneously. As we walked about the precinct, from which grass, weeds, and briars were neatly mowed, we noticed that a tall young persimmon tree had reached out above one grave and dropped an earthy gift of ripe, bright orange persimmons on it, a companionable gesture, I thought, and picked up a few to eat, as the farmer lying underneath would undoubtedly have done if he could have. After a while we got back into Nina's car and drove farther into the reserve. The state's new, well-paved roads do not follow the routes of our old dirt roads, and there are few signs remaining of our occupancy. That is to be expected. The land never completely possessed by any holder soon forgets its temporary owners. Besides, the state of Indiana, like any private citizen, coming into possession of a piece of property, had begun at once to stamp its own personality on the place. It planted thousands of evergreens, which to former landholders seemed like carrying coals to Newcastle, because the hills and ridges were already well forested with native trees, and in time of extreme drought evergreens could be a fire hazard. But the state built a fire tower, it set up a CCC camp, it established picnic areas with tables, fireplaces, shelter houses, it constructed a lake and built a new house for its supervisor to live in, choosing a site just back of the place where our house had burned. When the orchardist family moved out of the house, a man who had always worked for my father moved in with his family as caretakers. The hired man's straight black hair, Indian-like profile, and swarthy skin gave support to the accepted belief that he was of Indian ancestry. He had a wife and several children, but for some years had carried on an illicit romance with the French-descended wife of a neighbor who was of German ancestry. The German, revolting finally against this international entanglement, angrily set fire to the orchardist's house with the hired man and his family in it. They escaped, but the house burned to the ground, and with it all our belongings. We had not moved away into the townhouse. Among these was a large collection of fine Indian arrowheads and hammers that had been picked up on the farm, evidence that Indians once considered this land theirs. Probably they knew its watering places, too. Draper, Hollow Spring, Sugar Spring, Cherry Spring, the Big Spring, the Little Spring, but by other names. Probably they, like the orchardist family, had seen the foxfire on the ground in the woods on damp summer nights and wondered about this mysterious phosphorescent fungus. There were many earth-covered mounds in the woods, which the orchardist children implicitly believed were Indian graves, and would yield up Indian bones and arrowheads if dug into. Now I realize they were the buried roots of giant trees, blown over in a storm and finally covered over and turned back into soil, in the thrifty way of nature to feed more plants. After the Indians there had been a pioneering man who started a little village there called Stringtown. The orchardist old house had been this man's inn, with one row of rooms set directly above another, identical row, and a long blind stairway going darkly, without benefit of banister, from the front door hall to a small upstairs hall. The innkeeper had a store, but his chief business was the tanning of hides in large square vats dug in the ground at the foot of the slope below the inn. When we lived there, the floors of the vats were still strewn with bits of old dry tan bark, so we called that pasture the tan yard. In the summer, when we kept the milk cow there, and my sister Nina and I did the milking, we carried the buckets to the pasture and set them under the cows wherever they stood to milk. I milked old June, the placid half-Jersey, half-shorthorn. Nina's hands were smaller than mine, so she milked the purebred Jersey, Flower, whose teats were short. Nina was younger than I and more aggressive, always thirsting for adventure and travel, but much more tender-hearted and generous than she wanted anyone to suspect. Her hair was the color of ripe cornstalks, and sunburned because she would never bother with a hat. Years later, when I used to read her palm, I was glad to find in it the protective line that looks after some people, and as she grew up, it seemed that whenever something of special importance was going to happen, it happened when she was there to see it. In late summer, ironweed grew tall in the tan yard, offering us its sprangly bouquets of small red-purple flowers. The short grass was thick and dark green. If we crossed the creek that bordered the pasture, we came to a wooded knoll which we called Hill Acres. There we had campfires, suppers, and gave plays written by my sister, Miriam. There we buried our best-loved pets. Miriam baked delicious cornbread in an oven-sized baking powder can in the coals and cooked a stew of meat and potatoes and things. That was so good nobody bothered to ask what the things were. We used odd, interesting dishes for these suppers. One of our best was the bone-white, clean-scraped carapace of a box turtle. It looked like a delicately sculptured bowl. In those days, Miriam said she wanted to be a doctor, and she practiced her healing art on all the sick dogs and cats and broken-legged chickens. Once, when one of her younger sisters had a huge fever blister on the lip, Miriam cut it off with the scissors, and no evil befell either child or the scissors, and the fever blister healed without leaving a scar. But Miriam had begun writing almost as soon as she learned to talk, and eventually she became a writer of children's books. She created fun and new games and wrote plays wherever she went. She was pretty and had smaller feet than the rest of us had. The unmarried hired men were always in love with her, and she was always engaged to them, innocently, 2 at a time. The orchardist loved his land, called it an empire. In his reading he was devoted to biographies of Napoleon and Lincoln. Someplace on the farm he discovered little flakes of raw, pure gold. Nobody ever knew where. He kept it in a tightly corked little bottle in his office. I have it now. When he bought the farm, seeing already in imagination the orchards and blocks of nursery stock he would plant there, it was known around the locality as the Old Sharp Farm. He renamed it High Gap, and we lived there 17 years before he was injured in an automobile accident, and we had to leave the farm, sadly, and as we believed temporarily. In the years he owned it, he added other small farms to it, the Cox Orchard, where frosty purple crab apples grew and fell ungathered on the ground, and sometimes in winter, on the way to school, we could find one still edible under the protecting leaves on the ground. The Landrum Place, where pungent perfume weed grew rank around the 2-room log cabin, and there were 2 giant oaks beside a well of bitter water, and a sweet apple tree whereof the apples had a water core, the Richard's Orchard, where strawberries ripened surprisingly early, so that on the first exploring trip you seldom had anything but a hat to carry them home in. Proudly the North Cherry Orchard, that had a little wet weather pond in the center, and there in the spring you heard the first hyla peepers and called them frogs. My father planted orchards every place. He knew the Latin names of plants and trees and called them by those names. He could identify all the peaches and apples. He experimented, was years ahead of his time in horticulture development. He had grafted an apple tree so that it bore sweet apples on one side and sour apples on the other, and his children thought this was magic. We believed that if he planted the wooden stove poker, with which we poked the fire in the wood-burning stove that heated the dining living room, the poker would probably take root, blossom, and bear interesting fruit. He said, I love any kind of tree, but of course a peach tree most of all. He propagated some new varieties of peach, the most successful being the Shipper's Late Red. In late May, the Shipper's Late Red Orchard, just across the big spring road in front of the house, was a cloud of pink bloom. There, in late summer, grew the most delicious peaches I've ever known. Those that were to be shipped by Interrobon to the Indianapolis market were carefully hand-picked a day or so ahead ahead of complete tree ripeness. Packed 85 or thereabout to a bushel, and loaded on the wagon in the evening. Early the next morning they were hauled 9 miles, as gently as the stony, rough roads and the horses would permit, into town. There they were large, yellow-fleshed, and velvety pink cheeks, and of perfect peach shape. The ground under those trees was kept free of sod, This was hand and shovel work, and deeply cultivated into a fine dust mulch. On quiet summer nights the tree-ripened big fruits let go and dropped gently, unbruised, upon the ground. In the mornings we could pick them up, break the skin by pinching it between a thumbnail and a fingernail, peel it off, thin as paper, and bite into the wonderful juicy ripeness of peach flavor concentrated there. To be really good, a peach has to be tree-ripened. A peach picked green is still green when it is rotten. People came from many miles to eat and buy the orchardist's spectacular peaches, and he took armloads of blue and red prize ribbons at the Indiana State Fairs. The road from town up through Happy Hollow to the orchard farm was steep. In places, the earth was washed off completely, leaving a pavement of sheer blue shale. It was a test for the horses we drove over it, and a test for the early automobiles in which people came out to buy peaches. That tense October afternoon there was no trace left of the shipper's late red orchard. There was no trace left either of the lower barn that had been nearby. Do you remember that dramatic night storm when we watched it struggle and pull like a living thing and finally collapse in the wind? Asked Nina softly, as if still awed. I did. The old barn had been had been weakening for years, unrepaired. By that night the huge hand-hewn poplar beams were pulling apart from the handmade wooden bends, the overburdened loft floor sagging badly. The barn loft had been one of our most exciting playhouses. We were strictly forbidden to go into it, so of course we went secretly. It had not been used for hay storage for many years, but in a board-enclosed corner there remained a 2-foot deep depth of old hay, dry and brittle, that made a kind of elevated cushion. The boards on that wall of the barn were loose at the barn loft floor level. Sitting on the hay cushion, we could push outward against the loose boards with our feet and let them spring back, somewhat like pumping a foot pedal. For some reason this seemed to us like a pipe organ, and there we played the pipe organ and sang, making up hilarious songs to sing as we pedaled. In the loft also were stacks of trough-like metal burners in which crude oil smudges could be built on cold late spring nights when frost threatened the peach blossoms. In the barn loft also the fascinating shoes were stored, still in their original boxes. At one time in his pre-orchard years, the orchardist had owned a part interest in a woman's shoe store. When the partnership was dissolved, he brought his part of the new unsold stock to the farm and stored it in the barn loft. The shoes had high heels and high button tops. Some were red leather with red cloth tops. We loved them, thought they were beautiful, and would gladly have worn them, but they were all too narrow for our feet. We were accustomed to going barefooted. Spring held no happier day than the morning when we could shed the long-legged, one-piece winter underwear that, however carefully tightly lapped about the leg, still made a bulge under the stocking. And on that day also one could cast off shoes and run barefooted in sensuous luxury on the grass. Our sister Miriam was the only one of us with feet small enough to get those beautiful red high-heeled shoes on her feet. The overflow from the orchardist's former offices was stored in the barn loft, many boxes of old business letters that we read, criticized, imitated, and admired. There were bushel baskets grown lopsided and weary from their overburden of old newspapers and catalogues. There was the orchardist's obsolete business stationery, imprinted with red stars and a former address. But our utmost delight in the barn loft was the roll-top office desk. Its drawers were swollen shut and stuck fast, the roll-top likewise unbudgeable. We worked on them for years, confident that if only we could get the drawers open undamaged, get great treasures of paper, pencils, crayons, and boxes of paints would be found there. We never succeeded, and playing forbiddenly in the barn loft, we had to be on guard against being seen or heard by anyone passing along the road, or by one of the hired men coming into the barn rooms below to get his coat and dinner bucket hanging there. We knew, as the birds of the air know, that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Unfortunately, when the state of Indiana took over my father's orchards and other farmland in that vicinity, none of the personnel knew enough about that wild backwoods area to appreciate its valuable landmarks or its distinctly Indiana legends and features. None of them thought to consult old-time residents still living there, who might have told them valuable Hoseriana. They could have collected much from Harve, bent, ageless, wrinkled as a potato in late spring, with friendly blue eyes squinted up in a lively smile. Harve's shoes always curled up at the toes because he bought them at rummage sales, and they were always several sizes too big for him. Perhaps he thought he would grow into them. He cut and hauled crosties for mother, or wove a split hickory seat in an old porch rocker for her, and kept her informed of local news. He hunted the woods for ginseng, which he called sang, and sold it for his own income. He walked from Hacker Creek, where he lived, to Happy Hollow, at least 5 miles away, to court a widow whose young son worked for the orchardist. It was Harve who told mother her house was haunted. The haunt, he said, was a headless woman who stood by the window of an upstairs middle bedroom, holding her head in her hand out of the window and singing, "Pass me not, O gentle Savior." My mother went ahead and papered the room, laid down clean straw on the floor, and covered it with strips of slick straw matting sewed together, and made a bedroom for her 4 middle children to sleep in. None of us ever did see the haunt. It was in that room, however, that we saw Gobby, and watched him come down from the attic for his only and dramatic personal appearance. Gobby was a mythical creature that we learned about from our sister Miriam. She told us news of him, and in his name exacted services she never could have exacted for herself. I think probably the idea came to her in some sudden inspiration of the moment. The personality of Gobby gained charm and prestige from her stories until he became so real to us that finally we demanded to see him. This was something Miriam had not anticipated. She put us off as long as possible. Finally she told us if we would swear to sit on the bed in the middle bedroom and not make a sound, she would persuade Gobby to appear. He would come down from the attic through a little trap door that had been cut in the ceiling for use in case of fire. We pulled a bureau under the trap door and set a chair beside it to make steps for Gobby's convenience. We had waited a long time when finally the trap door lifted and silently, while we watched almost without breathing, Gabi began to appear. First one foot, in a high-heeled shoe, reaching around blindly to find the bureau to step on, then a leg. Finally, a whole body clad only in a suit of tight-fitting, long winter underwear with a jaunty hole snagged over one hip. We watched in complete silence. Gabi had long brown braids and freckles on the face exactly like Miriam's, but so strong was the spell we could not be sure. Then suddenly I let out a cry. Without a word, Gabi turned accusing eyes on me and vanished quickly through the little dark hall. But I didn't care. I had just remembered that only Miriam had feet small enough to get into those tiny, high-heeled, red-topped button shoes Gabi had on. We never heard of Gabi again after that. Two familiar traces remaining that October afternoon were the two giant oaks at the Landrum place, but the road on which we drove ran right over the spot where the sweet apple tree had stood. There was no trace left of the long rows of black-cap Cumberland raspberries. Gone the gooseberry bushes, the red and the white currant bushes, the plot of ornamental shrubs near the hired man's cabin. On this plot japonicas, unsold, grew too large for transplanting. And bore their delicately fragrant red-flecked yellow quinces that were as hard as wood and irresistible to the hired man's thrifty mother. She had gathered a mess of those strange-looking fruits to cook, and later demanded angrily of the orchardist, "What is them things, anyway? I cooked 'em all day, and they never did get soft." Gone was the cabin itself, and the big weeping mulberry tree the orchardist had planted in its yard, and the cherry orchard in front of it. Gone the row of pink roses that ran the full length of the cherry orchard, and in June made a rain of some sun-warmed pink petals. In our childhood we gathered these petals by the bucketful for my sister Grace and mother to make into rose jars and beads. The beads were made of a paste from salt and ground-up rose petals, formed into cherry-sized balls and dried on a long hat pin so they could later be strung. They turned black and had a pleasant smell, but disintegrated if they became damp. This project was one of many cultural experiments promoted by my sister Grace, who read all the women's magazines she could get and hoarded them for years, and also read all the books in our family's extensive library. She was supposed to ask the orchardist's permission before reading any book, but actually she read first and then asked, for fear he might say no about one of them. My sister Miriam also read most of the books. A volume of Poe's Weird Tales in an expensive pale blue and gold binding so haunted and depressed her that she buried it, and when she dug it up later, it was no longer in a condition for anyone to read. My sister Grace read catalogs and cookbooks with as much fervor as she read novels, and was fascinated by gourmet recipes and foreign words. Having run across the name Springerl Foreman somewhere, she liked the name and gave her own mispronunciation of it, Springery Foreman, to a drink she prepared for us in spring. It was green onions cut into bits and floating in weakened vinegar, not weakened enough, however, with salt and pepper added. We drank it and liked it as well as the lemonade my sister, Miriam, made from red sumac berries. Another time, having read about sorrel soup, Grace decided to try it out on the family. She always did these experiments when Mother had gone to town, leaving her in charge. Unfortunately, she was not enough of a botanist to identify different kinds of sorrel, and what she used was common sour grass, so the soup was not a real success with the brother, sisters, cousin, and hired men she served it to, although everybody remembered it for years. Her fried radishes met with about the same degree of favor. We always had these interesting meals when Mother left Grace in charge, but we had a way of getting rid of the evidence without wasting it. Before Mother got back, we had a grab dinner in which all leftovers were put on the table and everybody sat down. The rule was you had to take out and eat a serving of anything set in front of your plate. Then you could pass it on to anyone you chose, not necessarily the person next to you. It was a much more hilarious, noisy game than Arthur's. Grace was always more interested in reading than anything else when Mother left, however, and once decided to get dinner immediately and get it out of the way so she would have a long time for reading. She cooked the food, summoned the family. Our cousin Ray, older than Grace, was living with us and working there then. He refused to come in from the field, so she angrily said, well then, he could just get along without dinner. But he was within his rights. It was only 9 o'clock in the morning when she called us to the table. Grace took piano lessons, displayed exceptional talent, and gave recitals in town. When the blind piano tuner came to tune the family's upright golden oak star piano, the orchardist paid him in money. My mother paid him with fresh-picked strawberries for dinner, but Grace paid him best to his liking by playing the Moonlight Sonata, which he said was his favorite music. I still remember the look on his listening face. He looked as if he could see by moonlight. Grace played classical music and subscribed to Etude. My mother played hymns, and sometimes on Sunday afternoons the orchardist sang with her. He did not have a particularly good voice, but he enjoyed it, especially the hymn, Leaning on Those Everlasting Arms. His best musical performance was on the Jew's harp.